some constitutional questions are being raised in the waning moments of this campaign, and we're going to talk about it tonight.
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
You know, kind of constitution and culture as they kind of meld together here with the, I don't know, the anxiety of this race and Donald Trump and his threats to jail Hillary and all that kind of thing. Welcome in. Nice to have you. We're going to get right to it tonight and kind of eliminate the rundown other than a major issue on the House election side. Today, the Speaker's right-hand guy sort of announced he's going to take one more shot at it. Here's the headline, which is kind of interesting. Speaker Mattiello backs the nominees over John DeSimone and Jan Malek. Jan Malek, a longtime rep from Bristol, of course, and John DeSimone, longtime Springfield rep right there, the majority leader. He got beat by 21 votes in his primary race. It was like, 500 and change to 500 and change. There was a count and all of that. Marsha Ranglin Vassell beat him, and she's part of the progressive liberal wing that is making inroads in the General Assembly. So DeSimone said today, and we'll spend more time talking about this over the course of the week, and I believe John is going to come in here next Wednesday. I think he's going to argue his point with us here directly. But he's suggesting that out of state and certainly out of district money negatively influenced the voters. And I have to laugh at that because only 500 people came out to vote for him. So, he was targeted. He was a sitting duck if he ran it the old-fashioned way, which is to say, I've always won this. It's a primary. This is a walk in the park. He didn't really respect his opponent, and he got his bell rung. Now he's going to do a write-in candidacy, and I will tell you that a write-in candidacy has never been successful, ever, not once in this state, on a state rep level. So it's kind of interesting stuff. That Nick Mattiello backs the primary winner makes party sense, but there's clearly a cold war, if not a rift, inside the leadership team here because DeSimone, again, is the majority leader, and Mattiello is kind of hands-off, had nothing to do with organizing his primary race, and has nothing to do with this. In fact, I'm told they haven't even talked to each other about this, so interesting stuff. We'll follow up over the course of the week. In the meantime, as we once again welcome you in, thank you very much for joining. Headlines in the presidential race dominate and shall for the next month or so. Trump speaks anxiously about the new topic, the prospect of losing. Now he's kind of sowing the seeds of maybe not too much sportsmanship. Here's CBS.
They don't give the support that we really need.
Okay,
now,
but I'm still confused.
I think I'm better off maybe without their support if you want to know the truth.
Donald Trump dismissed the damage done by a divided party, saying he doesn't need establishment help.
I wouldn't want to be in a foxhole with a lot of these people, that I can tell you.
But McCain's a brave man.
Including Ryan.
He's a brave man, McCain.
By the way, including Ryan, especially
I got
Ryan.
that.
Since the release of the now infamous Access Hollywood video,
you can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab him by the
a new survey found of the 331 Republican lawmakers, governors, senators, and those in Congress, more than a quarter are not endorsing Trump. Trump says if the 2005 tape is what pushed wavering Republicans over the edge, that's just sad.
If that's what's going to take to lose an election, that would be pretty sad. Then I have to go back to my other life.
Speaking to thousands in Florida,
the polls are pretty even in Florida. You don't let me down.
Trump also spoke anxiously about a new topic, the prospect of losing.
If I don't win, it will be the single greatest waste of time, energy, and money.
To drive up enthusiasm, Trump mined the new trove of leaked emails to attack Clinton.
Even Chelsea Clinton, the WikiLeaks email show, expressed serious concerns about conflicts of interest at the Clinton Foundation.
Trump cited Chelsea Clinton's attempts to flag the campaign on possible conflicts of interest regarding her father's close aides and the Clinton Foundation.
It's just the latest evidence of the hatred that the Clinton campaign has, really for everyday Americans, and you see it. And you see so much from these WikiLeaks.
I know, Donald. Corey Brettschneider is a political scientist and constitutional scholar at Brown University. He returns to the program. Nice to have you. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here, as always.
I always get a kick over Donald Trump's hyperbole If he loses, it'll be the biggest waste of time, money, and da 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 da. You know, first of all, I hate to break it to Donald. Most candidates have a tremendous letdown when they lose anyway, certainly on this level. Right. But if he really feels that way, maybe he ought to check himself and find out what kind of value system he's brought to the race, that if there are many candidates who will have made a statement and lost, a la Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders stood for something.
Yeah.
What does Donald Trump stand for? Maybe he has to examine himself and ask himself what he stands for before he says the whole thing would be a waste if he loses, right?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like what he stands for is himself and his own glory rather than anything about principles of democracy or, I mean, if you think of what most people would say, maybe we're sick of hearing it, but you know, it rings true that the point of running for office isn't supposed to be about furthering yourself. It's supposed to be about the common good. It's supposed to be about at least some kind of issue that's beyond oneself. And this person doesn't seem to have any of that that value system. I mean, I've said from the beginning, it doesn't look like he's running for the office of president, which requires us to uphold the values of the Constitution and pursue the common good. It looks like he's running to be a celebrity and to enhance his own self-worth through the electoral process.
In the next segment, we're going to talk about some of the constitutional issues and some of the threats that Donald Trump has issued here, whether they are, again, hyperbole or something he means. The difficulty is that you can never figure out whether he means what he says or understands what he says. And you know, in general, without being specific about a specific comment until next segment, you have raised the concern that he really doesn't understand what he's running for.
I was worried even more than I was during our last discussions early on in the race that he might not understand the basics of the system. When he said to Hillary Clinton during the exchange about carried interest, if I was a senator, I would have made sure it happened. It raised the question of whether he understands what a veto is or whether he understands what's involved in the democratic process, which is convincing others to go along with you. If you're one of 100 senators, and of course you have the other house, the House of Representatives, to convince as well, does he have a basic understanding of the way democracy works? Yet again, there was a suggestion that maybe he didn't. Last time we talked about this other statement that he made casually about his sister signing a bill when he was talking about her decision to, in a court case, strike down legislation as unconstitutional. So he doesn't seem to know a lot, and he doesn't seem to care about the basics of our system or about the values of our system.
And I'm interested in this concept that he'll have great people around him. Have the great people around him actually explained to him that he's not running for king and that this is not a totalitarian effort here? Or I'm confused over that.
It seems like he surrounds himself by people who further his ego. That's how he chooses his advisors, and when people stand up to him, they find themselves on the outs. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that he's been told about the basics of our system, or that he's been encouraged, as any candidate should be, to learn something about the issues. Now, look, being president of the United States requires making decisions on a whole slew of policy issues. No one can know that from the get-go. But the point is that you put the time in to learn. And you saw, one candidate who spent her life trying to master the issues, and another one who just doesn't seem to think it's that important. The
campaign chair, Steve Bannon, has made a point of singling out Speaker Ryan. He's had an axe to grind with that guy for quite some time. I wonder if this angst that Donald Trump now has with Speaker Ryan is more of a transference of some of the energy that his new chair is bringing to the table. Any thoughts on that?
That's interesting. I mean, I don't know the inside baseball well enough. I mean, to me, there's a common sense explanation of what's happened, which is that Paul Ryan thought that he could control Trump. And as time went on, it became increasingly clear that this was not somebody who was going to be controlled, and it wasn't somebody who you were going to be able to use in the service of Paul Ryan's own ends. And I think that, that combined with the fact that he was losing was just a breaking point.
Constitutional issues to come, political issues here, running against your own party leadership this late in the game is, well, it's fascinating in some ways, but it could be incredibly destructive.
It could destroy the party. The traditional approach to presidential races is that you don't run as an independent, and there's not an instance of a successful independent candidate for president of the United States. You run with a party apparatus. One thing that's historic about what he's done is he's just jettisoned this and used his Twitter account where you would have relied on party machinery in the past. It's not going to work. I don't think he'll become president of the United States, but he's certainly shown that it's possible to run without the backing of, as he calls them, ordinary politicians. He's running truly against everyone, including his own party.
When we come back, I want to talk about the culture and Constitution. Take a look at this headline, and it comes, from the debate the other night. Trump's threat to jail Clinton also targets democracy's institutions. Our guest is expert in these issues, and I want to ask him what he thinks about this. In the meantime, I just want to remind you that if you're thinking about a new kitchen or bath, Cumberland Kitchen and Bath Design Center would be a perfect place for you to shop. A designer will come see you in your home. You don't even have to go there. Mendon Road across from exit 10, certainly open 6 days a week, and you can stop in and kick the tires a little bit. But if you're ready to go and you say you want a brand new kitchen because you got the family coming over for the holidays, you need a designer to get in there toot sweet and take a good look. Go to their website, cumberlandkitchen.com, and see some great before and after photos. You'll have the confidence that I did to do the job with Cumberland Kitchen and Bath Design Center. Be right back.
Trump said if he becomes president, he'll hire a special prosecutor to investigate Clinton's use of a private email server while she was Secretary of State.
It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Because you'd be in jail.
Clinton's campaign manager called the comments disappointing.
This is just Donald Trump trying to intimidate Hillary, bully Hillary.
You concerned about that threat?
Oh, yeah, I think of all the
As
things...
a constitutional scholar?
Of all the things that we've discussed, his opposition to the First Amendment, his refusal to recognize the freedom of the press, his incredible racism and opposition really to the principles of the Equal Protection Clause. This is on a par with the worst of those because it suggests that he rejects the basic principle of the rule of law. In non-democracies, what defines them is that there are not smooth transitions to power that are peaceful. It's that one party tries to imprison the other. And this wasn't about an investigation or anything within the bounds of reasonable governance. He says at the end of that exchange, you would be in jail. That's the conclusion that he's drawn. And the rest of it is all about trying to build up to that moment. So I think that's what defines a non-democracy, a dictatorship, is that one person tries to put their political opponents in prison.
Well, I think it's important. You deftly and understandably insert opinion about him in the middle of your constitutional analysis. So take the racism stuff out, and,
Sure.
and the other. Not that I'm arguing those points, but just stay with me on the purity of your constitutional analysis.
Yeah.
And let's dig a little bit deeper into this. The idea that you would float the projection that she would be in jail.
Right.
That you are going to launch an investigation, that you will instruct the Attorney General to pursue the candidate that you're running against, is an unprecedented piece of rhetoric. I've never seen that before.
I think there's one parallel, and that's the circumstances are, of course, very different, but Nixon's attempt to really meddle with the investigation into his own actions during Watergate, including trying to, repeatedly firing his own attorneys general and trying to intervene with the appointment of Cox.
To protect himself, though.
To protect himself, yeah. This maybe is worse because that at least has the suggestion, as you gave, that it's about preservation of the office, and he had an argument about the independence of the presidency. I don't know. I think it was pretty bad, and historically, one of the worst abuses of executive power. This is probably worse because you have somebody threatening to jail a political opponent. Even if you think that she violated the law, let's just grant that she wasn't careful, it was a crime of negligence, and the idea that it would come with serious jail time because she was basically careless at worst with the emails, is absurd. I mean, so even
What's
take him
absurd?
at his word. The idea that the crime that she supposedly committed, which I'm suggesting at worst is a crime of negligence. Nobody thinks she intentionally leaked these emails to a foreign power or that she was involved in espionage. Not even Trump has suggested that. So if it's a crime of negligence, think of what the penalty should be for being negligent. It's not jail time. It's a fine, or it's a reprimand, or maybe it's a suggestion that she's not qualified to hold office. But it is not what he suggested.
Well, I guess our criminal code, this falls into a much more complicated white-collar criminal area. But there's a lot of involuntary actions that result in jail time and that kind of thing. But the sitting FBI director has already been, out front with his arguments as to why this was not prosecutable.
Right.
The sitting attorney general has supported that. I get that he's not happy with the investigation and that his candidacy is driven in part by people being unhappy with the results of that investigation. But at some juncture, I don't know that you pick that ball back up. I don't know what the continuum is into his presidency, should he win, and what the urgency is.
Right.
She doesn't have an ongoing criminal enterprise
that
going
happened
on.
in the past. Yeah, he's suggesting he would prioritize it, and the question is why. And the answer is because he's trying to jail a political opponent. I thought Eric Holder put it best. He said, the president doesn't tell the attorney general who to prosecute. The idea is the office is independent. The founders, there was a proposal that wasn't adopted that the attorney general would be independently elected. And the reason why they suggested that might be a good thing is because you want, obviously, independence from political whims in the office of the attorney general. Now, they didn't go that route, I think, because of the thought that the president would have enough constitutional sense and enough respect for the rule of law to not direct the attorney general to put opponents in jail. So really, again, what he's doing when he says that this is his plan is he's demonstrating his lack of knowledge and hostility to the basic principles of the rule of law.
And there's a culture. For 250 years, this country has, at the end of an election, had a dynamic where the loser picks up the phone, congratulates the winner, begins to validate the winner. I mean, obviously, the Gore-Bush dispute in Florida is historic, and nobody believed that the votes were properly counted. In lieu of that, there's a tradition of buying into the results of the election, congratulating the winner, giving the winner the boost to suggest that they should govern full throttle. I don't hear any tone. Now, that's not constitutional, that's cultural, correct?
Right. I think it's both. I mean, the most minimalist standard for judging whether something is a country is a democracy or not is one that was proposed some years ago, and it simply says, is there a series of peaceful transitions in the power holders from one to the other, between political parties, for instance? And that's the minimum requirement. Now, I think there will be a peaceful transition. He said explicitly that he doesn't plan to contest the election should she win, and hopefully that's true.
He keeps using the word rigged.
But he says rigged, and then he uses, that's why I found this so troubling, the thought that she was acting in a way that needed criminal prosecution as a way of undermining the legitimacy of the results, along with this unsubstantiated claim about cheating.
When we come back, we'll talk about, how the winner governs, because this has been ugly. Stay with us.
On the day that I was in the Situation Room watching the raid that brought Osama bin Laden to justice, he was hosting Celebrity Apprentice. So if he wants to talk about what we've been doing the last 30 years, bring it on.
Okay, she's likely to win. Any chance you think there could be a Brexit thing here, where we get surprised?
Very little. I mean, the latest polls have shown Nate Silver has it at I don't know, 15% or something chance, and I guess something wild could happen, and there's a lot at stake. So any risk.
Well,
is
150 hitters sometimes park it into the left field seats, but I'm with you on that. She is hardly a flawless candidate. I can almost feel the viewers sometimes when we talk about Trump. So he's so centric and so dominant to this conversation that it's almost as if he doesn't even get that he camouflages legitimate criticism of Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
I mean, she did seemingly have a hypocritical moment and/or inside baseball moment with Wall Street that we learned through the WikiLeaks. There's more, as the CBS package pointed out today, that she's got to answer for. But his entire game plan and now his scorched earth policy inside the party is such a dominant conversation. We don't get a lot of time to talk about her.
I mean, it's a shame because there are real issues that he's brought up, not in a systematic way that would be appropriate for two candidates who want to lead this nation to discuss. One, I think I was glad it was brought up. It wasn't discussed thoroughly, but is the campaign finance question. And we do have a serious problem in this country where elections are run in a way that either one has to go out and get donations from very wealthy people, which he's correct, she has largely spent a lot of her time doing, or be a billionaire oneself, as he is. And that's a system that has to be fixed. Thankfully, Hillary Clinton has proposed a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, the case that says that corporations can give unlimited amounts from their own treasury in independent expenditure, not to candidates. And I think that's an important step. A more direct way to do this would be to appoint justices who have a more reasonable conception.
I get worried about that. The constitutional amendment route is one thing. Having litmus tests for justices. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, there's always a checklist, right? Of how do you feel about this? How do you feel about that?
Right.
But I would hope that she would think about appointing justices that have clarity of thought, constitutional skill, all those things before we start saying, hey, how do you feel about Citizens United?
I agree. I mean, the way that I would think that she would conduct these interviews wouldn't be to say, here's a list of cases, tell me, yes or no. I think she would have an intelligent discussion about the meaning of the free speech clause, and she would ask whether or not you read it in an absolute way that protects unlimited giving in the way that Citizens United does on the part of corporations, or whether you think it has to be read in combination with the desire to have a robust democracy that uses campaign finance laws to ensure that average people can participate. And that's very different.
The notion if she wins governing, she's going to have a big headwind that she's got to run up against in this particular case, don't you think?
Well, I think one of the huge questions that's unanswered is what is next. And so Donald Trump has created a movement that is, in my view, anti-constitutionalist, anti-democratic. And she's going to have to figure out how to bring these people into the tent or how to deal with what really is she used that unfortunate phrasing of the deplorables. But there are deplorable people who are supporting Donald Trump. David Duke and his ilk have felt empowered. Now, that's a real threat to democracy.
There's deplorable people on both sides, just not too smart for her.
No, it was not a good phrase.
15 seconds. You're bullish on the future here, or you're worried about it?
I'm an optimist. I think he's going to lose, and I think that she's going to govern in a way that is inclusive and that's going to restore the American idea that regardless of race or ethnicity, that we all have a place in this country. So I am optimistic that we'll get through this national nightmare and things will start to look good.
We'll have you back. Thanks.
Thank
Professor.
you. Real pleasure.
Final word and we come back. Stay with us. It dawns on me that we've got a lot of guests here not too high on Donald Trump, and given that I'm not either, it feels somewhat weighted sometimes. If you're not in academia and you're not in the establishment, but you want to sit here and argue, just let us know. Time's a wasting. Good night.